Hello, I will be lecturing on reading number 15, Adderall Abuse on College Campuses, a Comprehensive Literature Review. So I narrowed this, there's a lot of information, try to get this on the slides here. Give me 1 second here. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so like I said, a lot of information on this. I really tried to keep it mostly on the slides to kind of help guide your reading here. But all right, let's get going. So introduction, we begin looking at the purpose of this article. Basically, the researchers set out to review a lot of different studies that were done on Adderall abuse on college campuses. So it's not just one study they're looking at here. They're looking at lots of different studies, hence the comprehensive reviews. So they want to look at stimulant abuse on college campuses. And they want to look at factors contributing to the use, self-medication and recreational use of the controlled substances. So not people who are necessarily, prescribed these medications here, but they're not, as they're not using it as a way as it is prescribed, perhaps not necessarily abusing it, but not necessarily using it as prescribed here. They're more concerned about the abusive use of these substances. They also want to discuss the potential for consequences and the implications about higher education should deal with this and along those lines. So, when we're doing this in person in class, usually I have a lot of input from the students, and there's usually a lot of examples of use on college or also, in high school, especially I have students who've come from, competitive, private schools where they see a lot of this, Adderall, Ritalin abuse on college campus for education here. But something to take, if higher education is aware of this, how may they deal with this? So moving on here, one of these things is making recommendations for, educating, combating, and helping students who are struggling with this type of abuse here. So, providing help through this research here. All right, so let's move on to the next slide here. Intended use for Adderall. So if we begin by looking at the intended use for Adderall, whether we're talking about Adderall or Ritalin, both of these stimulant drugs, both of these are stimulant drugs that are prescription medication here. They're used to treat lots of different things, most commonly ADD and ADHD. That's what we're kind of most familiar with for these uses. They also treat asthma, obesity, and other neurological disorders. At first glance, it might seem like it doesn't make any sense. Or maybe it's even like cruel to give people who struggle with ADD or ADHD stimulants. Right, because we might think, especially if they have ADD, they have high productivity, they already have too much energy. Oops, excuse me 1 second. Or yeah, so we're looking, once again, the thought about giving this, ADHD or ADHD, giving people stimulants who struggle with this, what's the thought on that, the ideology there. But if they're, we think ADHD, high productivity, hyper, a lot of energy, this might be counterintuitive. But because they already have too much energy, why would we give them stimulants? I don't understand. But, the school of thought or logic is that for people who actually have these disorders, ADD, ADHD, excuse me, 1 second. Sorry. Anyways, moving on. But yeah, ADD, ADHD. The medicine kind of has a parabolic effect, meaning that it speeds them so that it speeds them up so much that it kind of hits a breaking point or a turning point, and it kind of calms them down, enables them to focus. So basically the idea is because they have so much energy that the stimulant, it actually counteracts that. But for someone who does not suffer from one of these disorders that we recommended or discussed here, this is when, we start to see the abuse for this or the use for academic purposes. I've known people who, who's never been diagnosed with these things, but receive Ritalin or Adderall here, were approved to treat it with this medications. But if certain people who don't have ADD, ADHD were to take these substances, then, they would receive the opposite effects here, so this would be Adderall, Ritalin would be very stimulating. They often times compare it operable to the effects of cocaine or speed when you look at the research. And so for the risk for the abuse and addiction is considerable when we look at these stimulants, especially for people who, don't have ADD, ADHD, and maybe abusing these for, these stimulating purposes, specifically perhaps using them in academics here. All right, so moving on to the next slide, academics here. We're seeing these substances being used a lot in the context of education here, and oftentimes for the single sake of education. And that's where we really start to see the abuse and misuse come in, and where we commonly see this is in education. So, as early as middle school, high school, and especially in college, we're aware of people taking these medications, students abusing these prescription stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin in hopes of achieving better grades, doing better, appealing, parents, the pressures for, academic success. The idea for people who suffer from ADHD or ADD, it helps them perform better by being able to focus. So if I'm a typical student without ADD or ADHD, and I take these substances, maybe this will give me an edge, kind of like performing enhancing substances for athletes. We see these prescription stimulants uses spreading across college campuses, becoming much more common. And instead of really being condemned or stigmatized here, what we're seeing is it's really being embraced by students and even by some to the extent of parents and society, because ultimately it is effective here. It increases attentiveness and concentration oftentimes. So it's this idea that, if there's a payoff, hey, I was able to study all night long, then it can almost be seen as something that makes sense or is useful, but there's lots of examples of students, staying up studying all night. I'm sure perhaps you can think of some examples or know some people who have used these stimulants as a study drug here. But, for all accounts from people I've talked to in different things, they've really found them to be effective in a way to study all night long here. So, there's a payoff. So you did better on the exam, mind you, maybe it's not that the Adderall makes you smarter per se here, but it just makes it so you don't need to go to sleep. You don't need to stop. You can continue studying. You can just go, and just get more studying done and be much more productive. And then your exam performance improves. So, if we look at the numbers, they're pretty staggering. Let me move on to the next slide here and look at some of these numbers here. Studies suggest that the percentage of students self-reporting their illicit uses, averaging the respective percentages here. So really looking at these numbers, you see that approximately 20% of the campus population are a subpopulation who are abusing prescription stimulants, and are usually there specifically Adderall or Ritalin. Those are the two common ones. According to a 2004 national survey on drug use and health, young adults between the ages of 18 and 25 have the highest reported incidence of illicit prescription use, meaning they're using it in a non-medical way, not prescribed, and it was just under 15%. The Monitoring of the Future National Survey revealed the prevalence of non-medical use of several drugs was at its highest rate in 15 years. The monitoring the future, I've mentioned this in the past. This really looks at high school students, but additionally college students self-reported higher rates in this study of abuse of Ritalin compared to their non-collegiate peers. So it's not just like, oh, young adults are struggling with the expectations of moving into adulthood. When we're look at these studies, it's just at this time period, so it's just this time period in life that's resulting in some abuse of these stimulants here. And it seems to be something specific to college life that's propelling these students to use these substances here. So as we can imagine, as you're a college student, and we'll move on to the next slide here. We can think of a lot of the contributing factors that are faced in college, but as you're college students, think of all the stressors, expectations, what you're supposed to get done. Oftentimes it feels like there's not enough time to complete all the tasks. So it's understandable, that perhaps students would turn to Adderall and Ritalin in the face of, education. So based on their review of the literature, there was, several contributing factors here to increase this trend of non-prescription medical prescription drug use like Adderall and Ritalin. So, looking at these, pressure for success, sociocultural factors, the collegiate lifestyle, and ultimately accessibility too, we see this pressure for success, these social cultural factors, collegiate lifestyle, and accessibility is all something you might be able to really kind of relate to right now at this time of your life. Obviously, with, COVID not being on campus, the accessibility might be a little different, but this is something, you could probably relate to before, COVID times, and also just these other pressure for success, collegiate lifestyle, all of these different things here. But we see, hold on one second, moving on to the next slide, pressure for success, looking at some of these different factors that they found from the literature here. Oh, excuse me one second. Oops, sorry about that. All right, so looking for these pressures for success here. One of these is, how is this a motivating factor here? This pressure for success and what influence this has on students. And where do these pressures come from here? We have parental pressure, high school pressure, collegiate pressure, all of these different things that really kind of factor in. Excuse me one second. I'm just going to pause this real quick. Excuse me, sorry about that. The pressure for success are starting at a younger and younger age. Some of this can maybe look back, but the whole family, K-12 education, and with increased emphasis on state testing and standardized testing, that just creates that much more pressure for success. As young kids, like second, third grades are already getting really focused. Maybe you can think about the standardized testing, taking those back, the stress, kind of the importance they place on them in school. But so we're looking at some of these different things and these but we can think about, this emphasis on state testing, standardized testing, and, the influence this might have on kids, being really focused in the second or third grade for, these hyper focus for these exams, and this builds and carries on as they go through their educational experience. This continues on, and we see, that at an early age, they start to feel these pressures and expectations. So to some extent, the desire for success does come within us, right? It's not just external here. But with that being said, some of us are propelled to be successful and we might be self-motivated or, more motivated. But us, most of the time, especially when we're young, the self-motivation is fueled or added by external pressures here. Oftentimes adults, such as parental pressure, high school pressure, and collegiate pressure. And these are all things we start to think of when we were young here. So, all right, moving on to this parental pressure here, which is something probably a lot of us can relate to. Today's parents, more so than any other generations, understand the requirements for college. More and more people are going to college, so more and more people of my generation, went to college. So more of those expectations for college here. And these people who have gone to college, my generation, oftentimes, have, or, even the generation before, we look really from the 60s moving on, but, we've had multiple generations oftentimes that have attended college or have gone to college, so there's these expectations. The parents, the adults involved in this you're aware of these expectations. So they understand the demands for going to college. And, now that it's, understanding this is also seen as a criteria for being a good parent for your child to be successful. So this really factors in, you feel these pressures as a parent, to, your child to be successful. So being a good parent doesn't just mean providing for your child. Now there's more to this, financially nurturing them, loving them. But, on top of that, it's, more than ever today, parents are measuring their success as parents based on, oftentimes really kind of looking at how well their children's are doing. And, I think, there's a lot of different factors and expectations, but, I think this is, fueled by social media. Also, oftentimes, presenting these expectations, which we see throughout social media, and how well other people's children are doing. These are the expectations. We go online, people are posting about how great their kids are, their success, and it's understandable. You get a little bit competitive once your student to be just doing this well. But, we look at all these things and how they factor into the expectations for children and also parents. So oftentimes parents are measuring their level of success as good parents based off of their achievements and how successful their children are. So increasingly, people as parents are putting higher and higher expectations on their kids for, a lot of different reasons here. But, ultimately, these higher expectations on children can also ensure that, the parents are viewed as good parents, so we see the stress, the pressures, all these different things and all the different places they come from. Reports show that 55% of students work hard to please their parents. I think a lot of us can think back young, and yeah, you receive some benefit from doing well, but a lot of it was, making your parents happy. And they said, in this study, they found 44% of students do it in response, parental pressure, meaning work hard, so really this emphasis on the pressure coming from the parents for, these students to, really take on these pressures, these expectations, and parents raise these expectations as their students progress through school, right? It's not like, all right, I did well, everything's good, they're going to lay off me. These expectations just get higher and the stakes get higher as you get higher in your education, right? Thinking about college, everything becomes so important, every decision. So you can think of, the expectations that parents have for their son, daughter, when they're in preschool, are very different from the expectations you're going to have when they reach middle school and high school and into college. But, each one with each, next step comes with, new expectations here, and these different expectations as you progress through your education here. So we think about it, the pressure builds and, kind of continues to build or amounts. Almost think of it as, like, boiling water or a stove or this slow boil, but this pressure for students is often mounting from a very early age. and just continues to build throughout time in their education here. And once again, it gets going. It's kind of easy to bubble over and become overwhelming, which, we see is the case with a lot of students. So we see in light of this parental pressure to be successful, not only for themselves, but also to please their parents and, make their parents feel like they've been successful parents. There's a lot of stress placed on these students, uh, you know, and it's not a big surprise that, many college students feel the need to abuse performance enhancing substances, to deal with the stress and anxiety of the pressures that are being put upon them in this, but we think about even, looking into high school pressure. I'm sure a lot of us can remember, every decision is framing, your future, what college you get into, what success, all of these different things. I think a lot of us can really relate to these high school pressures, but this really seems to be the real birthplace of academic competition. This is where, things, even though we've had pressure on us prior to that in an academic setting, but this is where things really seem to start to matter in today's economy, especially, really looking, you all know increasingly we need a college education to be competitive. They continually emphasize this. Excuse me. And if you don't do well in high school, then it's much harder to get into and be successful in college. And we're faced with all these in high school with all these pressures. So there's this, this is where this dial on the stress and the pressure really gets turned up on students, and you really start to feel this 79, they report 79% of students work hard just to earn grades needed to get into a college. This is their main motivating factor. They're competing to earn the best grades. But the most involved do community service, get the highest test scores, whatever is necessary to get into the top colleges. And it's being more and more competitive, to get into college. More and more students are going to college, which is just making it that much more competitive. Every decision you make is a factor in whether you're going to get into college or not. As you guys know, a student needs much more well-rounded applications now when applying to college. When I was applying to college, this was 2001. Yeah, I know. Anyways, I won't make a comment. Yeah, they were stressing on extracurriculars and stuff, and it was definitely more than just having good grades was something you needed. But ultimately the expectations were still, if your grades are good enough, you don't need to worry about anything else, right? If your grades aren't that great, then you really need to have all this extra stuff. I can attest to that. I had really strong grades in high school. I definitely did not do much of the extracurricular activities outside of, I played a little bit of sports, the golf team, what an athlete I was. Today, increasingly, to get into a four-year university right out of high school, there's a lot of expectations, especially, for these competitive schools. You might not only need good grades, but you need to have this extracurricular activities. You need amazing exam scores. You need all that stuff. So for a lot of students abusing substances such as Adderall, when you think of all these extra stresses, it seems to be a natural consequence of this academic pressure. And it is, as I said, it's becoming more and more competitive to get into college. So these stressors, these pressures are getting that much more difficult. Admissions offices are receiving more and more applications. We see an increase between 8 and 41%, in these applications here, but that does not necessarily, mean that there's more spots available for students just because there's these more applications. It's just becoming that much more competitive, to get into here. So, these institutions, these competitive colleges are more selective than they ever were in the past, and students know this, and their learning is not just good enough, so they believe that prescription stimulant is necessary to beat out the competition to get into college. And, this is something you ask a lot of students. And, I ask my students when we're in person in class, do they believe Adderall or Ritalin is, a way of cheating? And, most students say, no, not really. I could take it if I want to. I either do or I don't, but it's really interesting to see that, there's really, um, you know, there's almost this expectation amongst college students regarding that, that it's just kind of understood. So moving on to this next slide here, collegiate pressure. Now you're in college here. You're out of high school, and now you're really in the pressure cooker. It's like, at first you think it's like, I've arrived, I've made it, okay. But then upon arriving to college, you realize, that there's a new set of pressures, expectations, and ultimately, oftentimes there's kind of realization that, suddenly you're at the next level of education, I was pretty high up in my high school class, thought I was, relatively smart. I did not think I was a genius, but suddenly, go to college and, pretty much everybody's got the same grades that you did. Suddenly you're not excelling, Um, and now you're competing with these people, these other top students from, around the state, around there, and ultimately, you really feel the pressure. I remember going to college. I was always really strong in math. And my first college class was just this German professor who just took notes on the board, and we all just, wrote as fast as we could and then would go home and try to make sense of it. And I remember thinking like, man, I used to breeze through math, and now I was just so incredibly stressed. And, I really felt that pressure from, basically the first week of my college maths class. So what and then, oftentimes you're not receiving straight A's, so you're struggling with the reality of earning lesser grades. You were a straight A student. Now all of a sudden you're working really hard just to get B's, and the psychologically, that's hard for students, Um, so in response to the lesser grades, they say, I'm going to work harder, I'm going to put in more work, I'm going to study harder, I'm going to make my parents happy, all of these different things, to try to, and, these students are ultimately just looking for a quick fix to compete with the other students, and if we're looking for a quick fix, we can kind of cheat, right? We can find a way to get, a way to get the answer that was, and try to find a way to get better grades. How can I increase my grades, and there's a lot of ways to do that for these students who want to be successful, but when they want to acquire knowledge, they want to do better grades, they want to get validation to earn that A on the exam. And, so what they realize is, if I use these stimulants, I can study more, I can be more focused, I can stay up much later, and I can do all these things to earn this better grade. And, and it full, if they would have obviously cheated, that would not be fulfilling. But, what they find is, there's more of a sense of accomplishment if you're just using these stimulants. It's still your own mental capacity. You're just using these stimulants to, stay up later, maybe be more focused, so it doesn't feel as much like cheating as it would copying somebody's answers or utilizing somebody else's paper. So this is a way to perhaps maybe frame it so it doesn't feel like cheating to them, or, like I said, doesn't feel like using somebody else's paper. All right, moving on, these socio-cultural factors here, so looking at some of these different factors that you face in college. These are the college students view recreational prescription drug use as acceptable. Perhaps, as I've said, my students talking in the past, really didn't frown on it. It was just if something you want to use or you don't, but it was kind of accepted, But when we think about, other drug use in college, we see that there's this much more acceptance, of these use of prescription drugs, or these kind of quote unquote study drugs that, they're often referred to. We tend to society, we've talked about this in class, but not think prescription drugs as not being as bad. Perhaps they're safer. It's okay. They were, prescribed from a doctor. They're used medicinally, so they've got to be safer. And we see that Adderall and Ritalin have been so prescribed pervasively and readily to young children, that it really gives the view that, they're not that dangerous. They're relatively safe. And this, is a big deal that students, believe that they're relatively safe, and ultimately it's not that big of a deal for them to be taking this. Everybody else is doing it, perhaps family, friends have been using these drugs for their whole life. So they really view it as something that is safe. There's kind of examples in their life already, but ultimately we see these different factors, where, they believe these drugs are safe, family use them, the prevalence, they're medicinal, they've been lab tested, they're manufactured by professionals. This isn't somebody being made in some, trailer lab. This is different than if you're buying drugs off the streets where you have no idea, what you're getting. This is a prescription, and so even this idea of, maybe they weren't prescribed to me, but ultimately they're medicinally, they've been manufactured through a drug company, and, they're much, much safer than these other drugs here. And ultimately they're distributed by a pharmacist. So these all, really lead to, these different factors, to why, this acceptance in college here. Moving on to the next slide here. Also continuing with these other social cultural factors, found that students considered peers to be the primary source of information about the drug, that's a major factor when you think of how common it is amongst college students. So they're not necessarily learning about their drugs from their health classes or their high school drug information, or any of these other academic classes. They're relying mainly on peers, and many of them had peers who had this drug prescribed to them and they were using it, and ultimately were finding success with it. And also they found that many people were abusing it. So these prescribed users tell others about the effects, which in turn creates more interest, causes non-users to be ultimately become abuse and perhaps addicts to these substances. So these are non-medicinal users of these substances, and obviously this can lead to addiction here, of the actual Adderall or Ritalin. And also we see that research points there's a higher probability of being addicted to also stimulants like cocaine if you are using Adderall and Ritalin here. So these are something that's really, something to think about. We see Adderall is advertised as a stimulant that is safe for medical use and academic use. This is where it's often prescribed. So oftentimes students just make the assumption that it must be safe for recreational use. Also, if they can use it for academics, it's government approved. And so again, this drug must be manageable, and, that it's not addictive. The government prescribed it. So many people use it. It's so common, there's not, a lot of dangers associated with this, but we see that's not the case at all. All right, moving on. Once again, the collegiate lifestyle here, just so we think of, outside of just, this actual academic use, but we think about it in terms of, this collegiate lifestyle, and outside of actually, using it for studying. We see that, the collegiate lifestyle also really seems to contribute to the rampant overuse of these drugs and the misuse of these substances here. It's seen as part of a norm of college life to stay up all night, whether, it's studying or is also to party. This is something that's almost a rite of passage for college. So it's almost this idea of you're just paying your dues as a college student. You're gonna stay up, study late, and you're also gonna stay up and party late. So well, abusing stimulants is going to help you stay up all night, whether it's meant for partying or studying. But we see that there's this abuse, for staying up all night, and it's whether it's related to partying or, studying here. But once again, it's just this idea, that today's college students are juggling a lot more than, say, college students 50, 70 years ago, right? There's just a much more stressors, fast-paced society, all of these different things that are going on that, college students are playing. For previous generations who went to college, they were mostly white men. You just went to college. That's what you did. Today, increasingly, that's the rarity that college students are just college students. You just go to college, take your classes. Most students work part-time, full-time, have family responsibilities here. It's not this privileged middle white class that's going, everything's taken care of them. Perhaps it's maybe it's your own kids, you're still living at home taking care of your siblings or whatever it is. College life for the average student is much different than it was 50, 70 years ago. People have much more fuller lives, they're juggling many more things than previous generations did, and ultimately feeling like there's just not enough hours in the day to take on everything you need. So it makes sense that students, people in today's society would turn to stimulants to help get them through their day and accomplish everything they want to accomplish. Ultimately it seems like a viable option for treating exhaustion while also enabling them to be better focused. So when you really look at all these different, it kind of makes sense why we see so much use of this Adderall and Ritalin. So ultimately, for a lot of students, they find the effects very appealing, for them to help in their day-to-day life. We talk about, this collegiate lifestyle and different things too. Some of the college students or some, studies that reported, I'm using it for studying. I take the pill for studying, and then when it was party time, I would actually snort the drug. But we see these different things that, play out in collegiate lifestyle. But that's kind of this joke, or not joke, but, kind of this adage amongst college students who use a lot of Adderall or Ritalin. If I'm studying, I swallow it. If I'm partying, I'm snorting it. But all right, moving on. Accessibility is a huge factor. We've talked about accessibility, kind of a little bit previously in this class, but also earlier in this article here about, looking into prescription drug use here. Oh, excuse me one second. But we see that accessibility is a big deal because ultimately we have access to it. And it's much easier, to available. We see common use, and ultimately easy to, track it down, seek it out if we wanted. It's just so rampantly available, and you're hearing these positive things about it. Then it becomes more of a temptation. Adderall is easily acceptable to college students, campus health centers, family doctors, parents, other students who prescribe are all sources of accessibility. In my previous class, I haven't had too many students really report, I'm receiving it from campus health centers or knowing about friends, but, there is a lot of research that points to that as an evidence, campus health centers, prescribing or, Adderall or Ritalin. We also see that the number of children diagnosed with ADD and ADHD, has increased dramatically, and these children grow up and become adults, go into high school and college, and so again, it kind of normalizes taking these substances. Perhaps you haven't, but somebody who has, you meet them, you realize how normal it becomes, and this is something, and also these people who, have these pre-existing prescriptions, potentially could divert or misdirect their medication. We see this is very common in college. giving it out to a friend, and, ultimately advancing someone's awareness, or, giving it to them so they become aware of it. And, once they've used it, perhaps they have positive results from it, and, are going to continue to use it when they need it. We see Adderall production. Excuse me. Sorry, Adderall production has increased dramatically as well. Possible explanation to this increase may be due to the simplistic diagnosis process used by doctors. Perhaps some of you have been diagnosed or something. Think about, what was the process to be diagnosed with ADD or ADHD? There's not like a lot, when we think of these tests, oftentimes it's just asking you certain questions or a list of questions. There's not like a psychological test that we use to test for ADD or ADHD. There's not some, just overarching test that has been accepted by all the medical facilities here, and ultimately we're oftentimes talking about children, really young kids who are getting diagnosed with this, they often, it's very common to suspect a child has ADD or ADHD, and oftentimes there's a questionnaire or a form that their teacher is asked to fill out. Oftentimes, educators are included in this role. Then their parents are asked to fill out, and that's taken to a family doctor. And, if you meet 7 out of 10 criteria, these different things, these forms from perhaps your parents and your teacher, perhaps you hit, these certain criteria, here you go. You might receive a prescription, and it's basically, here's your prescription, you met the criteria, take this, where I'm going to prescribe you this pill. And obviously it's not just pop it out, they're professional about it, but ultimately to get a prescription for Adderall, Ritalin at a young age, isn't an incredibly long, detailed process here. And, as we get older and move into adulthood, and we're not talking about a young childhood here, it might be something as just as simple as seeing a doctor complaining of the symptoms of ADHD or ADHD, and they will readily prescribe the medication. Perhaps, they might have you fill out some type of form or answer a questionnaire, but especially for adults, we can, go in, see our doctor, tell about the, complaints about, things that we might think be related to ADHD or ADD, and, ultimately get the prescription relatively easily. So moving on to next slide here. Because the symptoms are so well known and there's no way to like physiologically verify them, there's no way they can hook you up to a brain scan or do anything to concretely verify that you have ADD or ADHD. It's pretty easy, to know what to respond to, and for students to ultimately fake the symptoms, right? You could go online and a quick Google search can tell you what to say, so what to say, what the symptoms are when you're like meeting with the doctor, and pretty easily get a prescription. The easiest way for college students to access Adderall is from friends who have a prescription, which we see, a lot of college students have it. So this isn't something, that isn't uncommon. And oftentimes, because it's so normalized on college campus, this person who has a prescription doesn't seem, that bad, or, that it's not like you're just giving away, some intense drug. It's like, oh, it's just Adderall or Ritalin, whatever, everyone's taking it. Hey, you got a big exam, like, feel free to take this. I remember being in college, I was offered a couple times. I never took it because I was too concerned that it would work and then I would never be able to. But, I definitely remember, casually being offered Adderall or Ritalin in college here, so it's common that they're willing, to share or give out what they have. So either students get their own prescriptions, or they have access to other students who have it, or, are happy to give or sell what they have. This is another thing, that perhaps, oftentimes, imagine you're a college student. Your parents' insurance is paying for your Adderall or Ritalin. Maybe you just use it for exams or, studying. So to make some extra money, you sell it on the side. This is another, way that something that this helps get it distributed on a college campus. But all right, moving on to the next slide here. So if we look at the effects of short-term use, a lot of the effects of Adderall use and abuse are very similar to other stimulant use and abuse like cocaine or meth. Adderall users are 20 more times likely to use cocaine and heroin. Once the body builds a tolerance for Adderall, especially think about this being 20 more times likely to be addicted to cocaine. Understandable, as your body builds a tolerance to Adderall, perhaps you're going to look for a stronger stimulant. So as you're not getting the effects from Adderall, perhaps you will turn to some other drug to try to get these effects, perhaps cocaine, maybe, these some type of other stimulant, and then they talk about, how that might, understandable to see how you're trying to get this stimulant and suddenly Adderall is not doing it. You might turn to a more powerful stimulant. Once you've overstimulated from Adderall, or perhaps you started using cocaine. Oftentimes when we use these central nervous system depressants, perhaps it moves on to heroin to try to temper down or bring us back down, so we see oftentimes as things spiral, perhaps you're using more stronger stimulants and then trying to use something else to, counterbalance these stimulants once you want to kind of come back down. We often see that students go from simply misusing or taking these pills to using it even more abusive ways in terms of using it in a way that's not intended. Even from, like I said, crushing it up and snorting it, is oftentimes the next step to, abusing this and, taking on more serious uses of the drug and ultimately perhaps switching to other stimulants. One quote was, once you swallow Adderall to study, you snort it for fun. So we talked about different methods of delivery that have, the impact of when you snort a substance. When you take Adderall versus when you snort it up and crush it, it's going to be delivered in a much more intense, concentrated form in your bloodstream. So this is something we see. It's common as, like I said, moving on to snorting it here. This pill was meant to be swallowed, digested by the stomach, and slowly make its way into your bloodstream. And now you're putting it up your nose and directly into your bloodstream through blood vessels and in your nose. So, you're taking it a different way here. And we can see how, this could increase, but some of the short-term use include blurred vision, increased body temperature, increased blood pressure, gastrointestinal problems, increased heart rate, reduced circulation, irritability, and insomnia. A lot of these symptoms and side effects are what we see, that meth users experience as well. And we see from pharmacological perspective, structurally, meth and Ritalin and Adderall are really not that different. And if you remember, I had you watch a video at the end of the terror management program, that article with the doctor who actually did studies and, pretty much said that, structurally, there's really no big difference between, these Adderall, Ritalin, and methamphetamine. And what they found in, studies was that people responded, had the same process to Adderall and Ritalin as they did as methamphetamine, you know. So if you want to go back and look at that video, really interesting the research kind of does. But, you know, a lot of research really points to the similarities of, you know, reactions, looking at case studies on methamphetamine compared to Adderall and Ritalin here. You know, ultimately they're both amphetamines here. All right, so moving on. Effects of prolonged use, hallucination, psychotic episode, cardiac arrest, coma, even death, you know, mood changes, you know, a lot of different things that, you know, we would associate with, you know, more serious stimulants. You know, these symptoms are associated with long-term, you know, methamphetamine use. It's hard to know if these symptoms are a direct consequence of that Adderall abuse, or it just comes from not sleeping, you know, so trying to understand a little bit more of that, but, you know, how much of that is related to the drug versus somebody who, you know, goes 3 days without sleeping, and what are the effects on the body, but ultimately that's still related, you know, to the drug. It is not uncommon to have hallucination and psychotic episodes and experience a lot of these symptoms. This has been well reported. So whether it's a direct result of the medicine, or a consequence of not enough sleeping, or a consequence ultimately as a consequence of the medicine, you know, I guess maybe it really doesn't matter. These are the outcomes here, but it seems to be more related to the lack of sleep. We often see intense mood changes and physical and mental cravings. This is something we also see, you know, that the drug tolerance increases with continued use, so you're going to need to use more. You know, so as you used to be able to just take a pill and stay up all night and study, perhaps you're going to need to, you know, turn to something more. You might need to take 2 pills. Suddenly that's not working. You just crush it up, you snort it, and see how that could kind of snowball and intensify. All right, so real quick, moving on to this next slide here. Sorry, I know there's a lot of information in here. I'll wrapping this up, but sorry, I hope really try to just put this all in the presentation here. Recommendations for students and schools. First, they need to begin to educate students, faculty, and staff on the danger, you know, the danger, the signs, and the symptoms of Adderall abuse. You know, the fact that these students in these studies said that they were learning about this medicine from their peers, you know, is something they need to factor in. You know, and that it wasn't really anything that was covered in any sort of curriculum in that class, you know, so really didn't feel like a lot of education. Perhaps think about your high school drug education classes. Did they address, you know, Adderall, Ritalin, these types of, you know, stimulants? Was this something you were informed about? You know, did you have an assembly or anything? You know, oftentimes parents are not aware of this, you know, they think this is, you know, medicine that my children has been prescribed, you know, and it's fine for them to use it. And they just, you know, make the medicine available to the children. You know, perhaps they're really not regulating this medication for the children. I specifically remember when I was younger, I've talked, well, never mind. In my death class, I talk a lot about my best friend who had abused drugs. Anyways, ultimately, his dad was dating a girl whose family had 3 kids with ADD, ADHD, and the medication was just readily available and out there. And my friend ended up, you know, taking the drugs. They never knew, you know, and he would steal them. Ultimately, you know, he was not satisfied with them, and it wasn't until he saw a news article that told him about crushing it up. But we see, you know, oftentimes, you know, perhaps this medication isn't regulated like, you know, if it was an oxycodone or something like that, you know, so oftentimes it's readily available out there. You know, this is not something that is hidden away. And especially, perhaps, more education, better regulations of the medication, making sure they're taking it when they should or as they should, utilizing that, and, ultimately faculty, staff, in these educational institutions need to be aware of this. And ultimately this is something that comes back to, I feel like, in all of these articles, but we need to look at for mental health counseling services, right, and deal with some of these different things that might lead someone to, turn to using these, so kind of going back to this sociological pharmacy stuff, some we've talked about earlier in the semester, but this idea, perhaps dealing with the mental struggles, the mental issues that would maybe have someone turn to these prescription medications or perhaps abuse them here. But ultimately this gets at also these socio factors, the fast-paced lives, our intense jobs, all the expectations, that oftentimes we feel we can't keep up with, and we're looking for some type of extra assistance to take on the stresses of our hectic lives. So this is kind of major. I don't think we're going to be changing anything, but thinking about the demands of the jobs we have and trying to support the family and all the pressures that that really places on us, and we start to face at an early age, even before that, but as high school students, perhaps working, volunteering, all these different things, this starts at a really young age, and we're aware of this. So what does this mean when such a large chunk of our population is feeling overwhelmed by the demands of society here, to where they have to take a drug illegally or, to complete their job or be successful in their day-to-day tasks, So something to really think about, maybe we need to rethink our expectations as an institution, perhaps even as a society. But if nothing else, try to really be much more aware of this issue and, offer more support for these students who are struggling with a lot of different stressors so that they can offer, handle it in many different ways. So one of the quotes, students may feel more inclined to help if there is a place for it, so this is a quote. We need to address the perception, how might students, their perceptions towards this drug, how perhaps they think it's safe, really coming through education, but, trying to break this, idea that it's no big deal, to take Adderall or whatever medications, and perhaps, medically, the pharmacy should maybe have more intense or more scrutinized curriculum, or that should be reviewed to, really understand someone who's getting given a prescription, and also what defines as prescription abuse in relation to, Adderall, Ritalin, and also diversion awareness classes, so it's, dealing with how is this getting diverted into the hands of, so many people here, so not just putting it, on doctors, handing out these prescriptions, but, perhaps they need more training, but also other people that are involved in this, and understanding, this diversion process. How is this, getting in the hands of so many more people, but ultimately more education, across the field, but, pharmacists, these different things, doctors, so they can perhaps be a little more discerning with the prescription path and, this prescription they're providing. So here's some of these videos I'm gonna let you watch on your own. I'm not gonna play these here. Go through and watch these. They're not going to be on the exam, so I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. Anything on the exam is going to be from these slides and my recorded lecture. Feel free to watch these videos. They're right here, pretty interesting. And I didn't post any of the discussion questions. I'm going to wrap this all up. I know this is a lot of information, so I'll end this here.